It is not enough, therefore, to oppose the centralized to the segmentary, nor is it enough to oppose two kinds of segmentarity, one supple and primitive, the other modern and rigidified. There is indeed a distinction between the two, but they are inseparable, they overlap, they are entangled. Primitive societies have nuclei of rigidity or arborification that as much anticipate the state as ward it off. Conversely, our societies are still suffused by a supple fabric without which their rigid segments would not hold. Supple segmentarity cannot be restricted to primitive peoples. It is not the vestige of the savage within us, but a perfectly contemporary function, inseparable from the other. Every society and every individual are thus plied by both segmentarities simultaneously, one molar, the other molecular. If they are distinct, it is because they do not have the same terms or the same relations or the same nature or even the same type of multiplicity. If they are inseparable, it is because they coexist and cross over into each other. The configurations differ, for example, between the primitives and us, but the two segmentarities are always in presupposition. In short, everything is political, but every politics is simultaneously a macropolitics and a micropolitics. Take aggregates of the perception or feeling type. Their molar organization, their rigid segmentarity, does not preclude the existence of an entire world of unconscious micropercepts, unconscious affects, fine segmentations that grasp or experience different things, are distributed and operate differently. There is a micropolitics of perception, affection, conversation, and so forth. If we consider the great binary aggregates, such as the sexes or classes, it is evident that they also cross over into molecular assemblages of a different nature, and that there is a double reciprocal dependency between them. For the two sexes imply a multiplicity of molecular combinations, bringing into play not only the man in the woman and the woman in the man, but the relation of each to the animal, the plant, etc., 1,000 tiny sexes. And social classes themselves imply masses that do not have the same kind of movement, distribution, or objectives, and do not wage the same kind of struggle. Attempts to distinguish mass from class effectively tend toward this limit. The notion of mass is a molecular notion operating according to a type of segmentation irreducible to the molar segmentarity of class. Yet, classes are indeed fashioned from masses. They crystallize them. And masses are constantly flowing or leaking from classes. Their reciprocal presupposition, however, does not preclude a difference in viewpoint, nature, scale, and function. Understood in this way, the notion of mass has entirely different connotations than Canetti's crowd. It is not sufficient to define bureaucracy by a rigid segmentarity with compartmentalization of contiguous offices, an office manager in each segment and the corresponding centralization at the end of the hall or on top of the tower. For at the same time there is a whole bureaucratic segmentation, a suppleness of and communication between offices, a bureaucratic perversion, a permanent inventiveness or creativity practiced even against administrative regulations. If Kafka is the greatest theorist of bureaucracy, it is because he shows how at a certain level, but which one, it is not localizable, the barriers between offices cease to be a definite dividing line and are immersed in a molecular medium, milieu, that dissolves them and simultaneously makes the office manager proliferate into micro-figures impossible to recognize or identify, discernible only when they are centralizable. Another regime coexistent with the separation and totalization of the rigid segments. We would even say that fascism implies a molecular regime that is distinct both from molar segments and their centralization. Doubtless, fascism invented the concept of the totalitarian state, but there is no reason to define fascism by a concept of its own devising. There are totalitarian states of the Stalinist or military dictatorship type that are not fascist. The concept of the totalitarian state applies only at the macro-political level to a rigid segmentarity and a particular mode of totalization and centralization. But fascism is inseparable from a proliferation of molecular forces in interaction, which skip from point to point before beginning to resonate together in the National Socialist state. Rural fascism and city or neighborhood fascism, youth fascism and war veterans fascism, fascism of the left and fascism of the right, fascism of the couple, family, school, and office. Every fascism is defined by a micro-black hole that stands on its own and communicates with the others before resonating in a great, generalized, central black hole. There is fascism when a war machine is installed in each hole, in every niche. Even after the National Socialist state had been established, micro-fascisms persisted that gave it unequaled ability to act upon the masses. Daniel Guérin is correct to say that if Hitler took power rather than taking over the German state administration, it was because from the beginning he had at his disposal micro-organizations, giving him an unequaled, irreplaceable ability to penetrate every cell of society. In other words, a molecular and supple segmentarity, flows capable of suffusing every kind of cell. Conversely, if capitalism came to consider the fascist experience as catastrophic, if it preferred to ally itself with Stalinist totalitarianism, which from its point of view was much more sensible and manageable, it was because the segmentarity and centralization of the latter was more classical and less fluid. What makes fascism dangerous is its molecular or micropolitical power, for it is a mass movement, a cancerous body rather than a totalitarian organism. American film has often depicted these molecular focal points: band, gang, sect, family, town, neighborhood, vehicle fascisms spare no one. Only microfascism provides an answer to the global question, why does desire desire its own repression? How can it desire its own repression? The masses certainly do not passively submit to power, nor do they want to be repressed in a kind of masochistic hysteria, nor are they tricked by an ideological lure. Desire is never separable from complex assemblages that necessarily tie into molecular levels, from microformations already shaping postures, attitudes, perceptions, expectations, semiotic systems, etc. Desire is never an undifferentiated instinctual energy, but itself results from a highly developed, engineered setup, rich in interactions, a whole supple segmentarity that processes molecular energies and potentially gives desire a fascist determination. Leftist organizations will not be the last to secrete microfascisms. It's too easy to be anti-fascist on the molar level and not even see the fascist inside you, the fascist you yourself sustain and nourish and cherish with molecules both personal and collective. 4 errors concerning this molecular and supple segmentarity are to be avoided. The first is axiological and consists in believing that a little suppleness is enough to make things better. But microfascisms are what make fascism so dangerous, and fine segmentations are as harmful as the most rigid of segments. The second is psychological, as if the molecular were in the realm of the imagination and applied only to the individual and inter-individual. But there is just as much social real on one line as on the other. Third, the 2 forms are not simply distinguished by size, as a small form and a large form. Although it is true that the molecular works in detail and operates in small groups, this does not mean that it is any less coextensive with the entire social field than molar organization. Finally, the qualitative difference between the 2 lines does not preclude their boosting or cutting into each other. There is always a proportional relation between the 2, directly or inversely proportional. In the first case, the stronger the molar organization is, the more it induces a molecularization of its own elements, relations, and elementary apparatuses. When the machine becomes planetary or cosmic, there is an increasing tendency for assemblages to miniaturize, to become micro-assemblages. Following André Gorz' formula, the only remaining element of work left under world capitalism is the molecular or molecularized individual, in other words, the mass individual. The administration of a great organized molar security has as its correlate a whole micromanagement of petty fears, a permanent molecular insecurity to the point that the motto of domestic policymakers might be a macropolitics of society by and for a micropolitics of insecurity. However, the second case is even more important. Molecular movements do not complement but rather thwart and break through the great worldwide organization. That is what French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was saying in his military and political geography lesson. The more balanced things are between East and West in an overcoating and overarmed dualist machine, the more destabilized they become along the other north-south line. There is always a Palestinian or Basque or Corsican to bring about a regional destabilization of security. The two great molar aggregates of the East and West are perpetually being undermined by a molecular segmentation causing a zigzag crack, making it difficult for them to keep their own segments in line. It is as if a line of flight, perhaps only a tiny trickle to begin with, leaked between the segments, escaping their centralization, eluding their totalization. The profound movements stirring in a society present themselves in this fashion, even if they are necessarily represented as a confrontation between molar segments. It is wrongly said, in Marxism in particular, that a society is defined by its contradictions. That is true only on the larger scale of things. From the viewpoint of micropolitics, a society is defined by its lines of flight, which are molecular. There is always something that flows or flees, that escapes the binary organizations, the resonance apparatus, and the overcoding machine. Things that are attributed to a change in values, the youth, women, the mad, etc. May 1968 in France was molecular, making what led up to it all the more imperceptible from the viewpoint of macropolitics. It happens that people who are very limited in outlook or are very old grasp the event better than the most advanced politicians, or politicians who consider themselves advanced from the viewpoint of organization. As Gabriel Tarde said, what one needs to know is which peasants, in which areas of the south of France, stopped greeting the local landowners. A very old, outdated landowner can, in this case, judge things better than a modernist. It was the same with May 68. Those who evaluated things in macro-political terms understood nothing of the event because something unaccountable was escaping. The politicians, the parties, the unions, many leftists were utterly vexed. They kept repeating over and over again that conditions were not ripe. It was as though they had been temporarily deprived of the entire dualism machine that made them valid spokespeople. Bizarrely, de Gaulle and even Pompidou understood much more than the others. A molecular flow was escaping, minuscule at first, then swelling, without, however, ceasing to be unassignable. The reverse, however, is also true. Molecular escapes and movements would be nothing if they did not return to the molar organizations to reshuffle their segments, their binary distributions of sexes, classes, and parties. The issue is that the molar and the molecular are distinguished not by size, scale, or dimension, but by the nature of the system of reference envisioned. Perhaps, then, the words line and segment should be reserved for molar organization, and other more suitable words should be sought from molecular composition. And in fact, whenever we can identify a well-defined, segmented line, we notice that it continues in another form, as a quantum flow. And in every instance we can locate a power center at the border between the two, defined not by an absolute exercise of power within its domain, but by the relative adaptations and conversions it effects between the line and the flow. Take a monetary flow with segments. These segments can be defined from several points of view, for example, from the viewpoint of a corporate budget, real wages, net profit, management salaries, interest on assets, reserves, investments, etc. Now, this line of payment money is linked to another aspect, namely the flow of financing money, which has not segments but rather poles, singularities, and quanta. The poles of the flow are the creation of money and its destruction. The singularities are nominal liquid assets. The quanta are inflation, deflation, stagflation, etc. This has led some to speak of a mutant, convulsive, creative, and circulatory flow, tied to desire and always subjacent to the solid line and its segments determining interest rates and supply and demand. In a balance of payment, we again encounter a binary segmentarity that distinguishes, for example, so-called autonomous operations from so-called compensatory operations. But movements of capital do not allow themselves to be segmented in this way, because they are the most thoroughly broken down according to their nature, duration, and the personality of the creditor or debtor. One no longer has any idea where to draw the line when dealing with these flows. Yet there is always a correlation between the two aspects, since linearization and segmentation are where flows run dry, but are also their point of departure for a new creation. When we talk about banking power, concentrated most notably in the central banks, it is indeed a question of the relative power to regulate as much as possible the communication, conversion, and co-adaptation of the two parts of the circuit. That is why power centers are defined much more by what escapes them or by their impotence than by their zone of power. In short, the molecular or microeconomics, micropolitics, is defined not by the smallness of its elements but by the nature of its mass, the quantum flow as opposed to the molar segmented line. The task of making the segments correspond to the quanta, of adjusting the segments to the quanta, implies hit-and-miss changes in rhythm and mode, rather than any omnipotence, and something always escapes.